Hi students, welcome to our first lesson in classical conditioning and learning in general. This first picture in the middle there is Ivan Pavlov, one of the founders, the founder of classical conditioning. He's responsible for classical conditioning itself, and we will describe that process along with some examples. This picture is the third grade class that was taught by my grandmother here in 1952, and right here is my mother, her student. My grandmother was a third grade teacher and my mother was a student. However, this is not really a picture of them. This is a random photo that was taken off the internet, and I assume that these students are in that class to learn. So learning is also known as conditioning. Conditioning is learning, learning is conditioning. When you see cognition, think thinking. When you see conditioning, think learning. We're going to specialize here in associative learning, and that is learning that certain events occur together. You have done this throughout your lifetime. You just didn't realize that what you were doing was learning. Two types of learning that we'll focus on is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. If this picture makes your mouth water, the thought of a lemon on your tongue, a dill pickle, or the taste of olives, if they make you salivate, that is because of associative learning. You have learned to associate the feeling of these sensations on your tongue, and they elicit a response out of you. This is associative learning. We associate that those foods will make us salivate. And it all originates with Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. Now, Pavlov was a physician. He did not set out to discover the principles of classical conditioning. Nonetheless, he did. So his backstory includes the fact that he was studying the digestion of our stomachs. And he found that when he would feed his dogs, that they would begin to salivate. So let's break down those principles here. After he found that the dogs were salivating, he devised this contraption to measure the salivation of the dogs. So his assistants would put food in the bowl, and they began to notice that the dogs would salivate just at the sound of the footsteps of the men approaching to feed him. And so he thought, maybe there's something here. The contraption used to measure the salivation was this little tube that was attached to the dogs, and it's kind of gruesome to think about today. But since he made this associative connections, he decided that he would pair a bell, the sound, with meat, or in his case, meat powder, and he knew that that would equal salivation. So what would happen if we rang the bell and did not give them meat? Would the dog still salivate? Well, Pavlov found that this was true. So classical conditioning is learning where a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus known as a US and elicits a conditioned response. Conditioned response means it's a learned response. Here's another example. So unconditioned stimulus is that which has the ability to produce a specified response before conditioning begins. In Pavlov's case, it was the meat powder. Food will produce an illicit response. The response is salivation. An unconditioned response is something that is produced by a natural or neutral stimulus, one that is nothing. So an unconditioned response could be the plate. A conditioned stimulus, an initially neutral stimulus that comes to produce a new response because it's associated with the unconditioned stimulus. For Pavlov's theory, the meat was paired with a bell. So the bell is the conditioned stimulus, that which now produces a response. The desired response is the sound of the bell, which produces salivation. Conditioned response is the salivation. Now we got pictures here of me swimming in Velveeta cheese. So here's a story of classical conditioning. At one time I had an intense craving for this Velveeta cheese. And so one night I snuck away, ate a bunch of Velveeta cheese, and then it made me sick. So Velveeta cheese initially was something that I would produce salivation. Now the conditioned response, the smell even of Velveeta cheese makes me feel a little bit nauseous. So that is now a conditioned response. Cheese, previously unconditioned stimulus, the thought or the putting Velveeta cheese near me would make me nauseous is a conditioned response. classical conditioning holds true these ideals. It's possible that extinction will occur after conditioning has taken place. Repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus without the meat will eventually make the conditioned response disappear. So if we were to ring the bell, not present the food, it does not produce the conditioned response, which is salivation. So eventually we will unlearn our conditioned responses. Reconditioning happens easily once we have learned to pair two things. When it comes to the sound of the bell, we recondition ourselves to salivate at the sound of the bell. Thus, it will be easier for us to relearn what we already knew. Now we're going to try this in class, and I will prove these principles to you. A spontaneous recovery happens when, following extinction, the conditioned response reappears at a reduced strength if the conditioned stimulus is presented again after a rest period. So we will make a spontaneous recovery, and we will be reconditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell. Stimulus generalization is after a conditioned response has been trained to a conditioned stimulus, that same conditioned response will tend to occur to similar stimuli without further training. The greater the similarity, the stronger the response will be. And so once we have learned or been conditioned to respond to a certain stimulus, those stimulus that are very similar will cause us to respond in the same manner. Discrimination, however, is not responding differently to different stimuli. So let me give you two examples. Stimulus generalization is the sound of a drill. I don't like the sound of a drill because I had an unpleasant experience at a dentist. Well, if I hear somebody out in the hallway drilling into the wall, that's going to give me the heebie-jeebies. My conditioned response is, whoo, I don't like that sound. So that I generalize my discomfort of all drills to the sound of a drill outside. Discrimination would be something like, I prefer Coca-Cola. If I'm going to drink a soda, I want to drink Coca-Cola. That is discrimination based on taste preference. The same might be true for peanut butter. I love peanut butter, and I only like one certain kind, actually two certain kinds of peanut butter. I love the sea salt creamy peanut butter from Trader Joe's and Smucker's natural peanut butter. Those are discrimination, but they based on taste preference. Further, so stimulus generalization, if it comes to fear of a dog. If I have experienced a painful bite from a dog, an unconditioned stimulus, the pain of the bite is something that I learned from. And my unconditioned response is, I don't want to be around dogs. Conditioned stimulus is the sight of any dog, generalized. Doesn't matter what kind of dog it is. And the conditioned response is fear. I fear all dogs. These are ways that classical conditioning can be influenced, that have a role in the levels of learning that we acquire. So timing, when we pair the bell with the food, the closer, the more effective. Predictability is, if we don't present the food with the bell, we're not going to learn to associate the two things together. The signal strength of the conditioned stimulus is strong, and the attention. Now, if we're not paying attention to making these associations, we're not going to learn the association. Now, how is this used in the real world? Well, it can be used for phobias, to treat phobias and reducing fears and phobias. So flooding is a person is exposed to the harmless stimulus until the fear and response to that stimulus are extinguished. So you fear snakes and you get thrown into a pit of snakes. That is flooding. Let's think of Indiana Jones. Snakes, I hate snakes. So he's always exposed to snakes. Does that fear go away? Well, with treatment perhaps. Systematic desensitization. People are taught relaxation techniques. So we put you in near a snake, and maybe deep breathing exercises, ways to refocus your attention elsewhere, and your fear is diminished. Counter conditioning is pairing a pleasant stimulus with that which we fear. Now, this is a case of, we're just going to call this kid that's holding the rabbit Peter just for fun, and he hates rabbits. But what we do is we counteract the fear by giving Peter a cookie as the rabbit gets closer. So here comes the rabbit, here have a cookie. Here comes the rabbit, here have a cookie. And now he begins to pair in his associative learning mind the cookie, the pleasant experience with the rabbit, and eventually the kid's holding the rabbit. Here is a practical use of classical conditioning, and the bell and pad method was used to train children not to wet the bed. The unconditioned stimulus in these, the unconditioned stimulus is a bell, and unconditioned response is to wake up to hear the bell. Now, how this worked was a little bit of urine would get on this pad that the child was sleeping on. It would wake the kid up, and the kid would say, oh, I'm supposed to wake up. They recognize the conditioned stimulus, that my bladder's full, so I need to get up. We will talk more about John B. Watson and the little Albert experiment in class. This is the classic classical conditioning, where John Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner took this orphan child, little Albert, and conditioned him to fear white fluffy animals. Not only white fluffy animals, he later generalized his fear to include lots of other things. So an unconditioned stimulus in this case was a loud bar sound, like a clang, when they presented a white rat. And that, of course, the sound of the clang made little Albert cry. And now they paired the white rat with the sound, and that caused little Albert to fear the white rat. So more on that story later. That's all for classical conditioning and associative learning for now. We will talk much more about this and provide you with more examples